This is section 69 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Advice. Dedication of Town Hall, Fairhaven, Massachusetts, February 22, 1894. Read by John Greenman.
By a thoughtful and judicious allotment of the privileges of this occasion, each speaker has been appointed to the function best suited to his capacity, his character, and his credit in the community. Chief of all the speakers and most eloquent stands the building itself. It is its easy office to declare to you the love of its builder for the town which was her birthplace and the home of her girlhood. It may be trusted to say its say well, and be understood, and be applauded from the heart, and to occupy the platform longer than anybody else, and make the only speech that will be printed right in the papers. Yes, and it is the only speaker of us all, gifted and popular as we try to let on to be, that can dare to stand up here and undertake to hold your unfatigued attention for 100 years. Why, we couldn't do it for 40. We all recognize the value of this building as an example and a suggestion to any who are moved by love for their fellow men to make gifts to them of hospitals or town halls or libraries, to build these things while they are alive, not wait till they are dead. If you do it while you are alive, it is really done, and well done. But if you wait till you are dead, there is but a barren result, and a divided profit. You get credit for the intention, and the lawyers get the money. The stomachs of the lawyers of this land are distended to utter discomfort with the eleemosynary architecture that they have swallowed. In all this world there is no joy like to the joy a lawyer feels when he sees a good-hearted, inconsiderate person erecting a free library, or a town hall, or a hospital in his will. He smiles the smile that only he knows how to smile, and goes into training for the Anaconda Act. Perhaps no one has ever known a dead man to try to do even the least little single thing without making a botch of it. The truth is, a dead man ought to lie still and keep quiet and try to behave. But if you can't teach him that, you can't teach him any useful thing. Everything about him is perishable but one thing, and that is his inability to accept the fact that circumstances over which he has no control have limited his activities, and first and last and all the time it is impossible to make him understand that there is nothing very large or fine or generous in spending his own money on himself and building hospitals with his children's cash. Why, some people do seem to get duller and duller the deader they get. Oh, well, perhaps it's no matter. It is the way they are made. Probably the mistake was in making them at all. I mean, if it was a mistake. I am no judge of that. But I wouldn't leave it to them. It was a pleasant and patriotic thought to dedicate this building and confirm this grace to Fairhaven on the natal day of Washington, George Washington, first of Americans, George Washington, the father of his country, George Washington, the father of those who cannot lie. The family has dwindled a good deal, but I am left yet, and when I look back over the waste of years and call up the faces of the others, and know that I shall see them no more in this life, and that I must remain now solitary and forlornly conspicuous to the last, the sole remnant of that old noble stock, it makes me feel sad, sad and, oh, so lonesome. What I owe to Washington no words of mine can tell. He was my model from my cradle up. All that I am, morally speaking, I owe to his example. Even in my tenderest youth his spirit was ever near to guide and succor me. The first time I ever stole a watermelon in my life, I think it was the first time, it was the thought of Washington that moved me to make restitution, restored me to the path of rectitude, made me morally whole again. When I found out it was a green watermelon, I was sorry, not superficially, but deeply and honestly sorry. Then came the thought of Washington, and I said to myself, "What would Washington do?" That is what I said to myself. What would Washington do if he had stolen a watermelon, green one? He would make restitution, that is what he would do, and that is what I did. I rose up spiritually refreshed and strong, and carried the watermelon back to the farmer's wagon and restored it to him, and said the merit was not mine but Washington's. And then I felt that inspiriting something, that electric thrill, that exaltation which rewards duty done, a moral victory won, a moral heroism added to one's stock of dear and precious memories. And I told the farmer he ought to be ashamed of himself going around working off green watermelons on people that had confidence in him, and made him give me a ripe one for it. And he was ashamed, and said he wouldn't ever do it again. So I forgave him, for when a person has done wrong and acknowledges it and is ashamed of it, that is enough for me. It was Washington that saved me that time. He has been my guardian angel ever since, and has had an active career. I am glad and proud to have an opportunity at last to help celebrate his memory and do honor to his noble name. In the distribution of the privileges of this platform, I was appointed to temper the gloss of the gay and thoughtless oratory of these others with the wholesome shadow of a few words of sober advice, for there is a time for such things, and it is meet that we recognize this truth, and rest our spirits with intervals of seriousness and solemnity. And so my advice to you, yes, more, my supplication, is that you live as Washington lived, live as I have lived, and build your gift halls and hospitals while you still live, and can build your hearts as well as your money into your gift. End of advice, read by John Greenman.
This is section 70 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Curtain Speech. Performance of Pudd'nhead Wilson, Herald Square Theater, New York, May 22, 1895. Read by John Greenman.
I am sure I could say many complimentary things about this play which Mr. Mayo has written, and about his portrayal of the chief character in it, and keep well within the bounds both of fact and of good taste, but I will limit myself to two or three. I do not know how to utter any higher praise than this, that when Mayo's Pudd'nhead walks this stage here, clothed in the charm of his gentle charities of speech and acts and the sweet simplicities and sincerities of his gracious nature, the thought in my mind is, why, bless your heart, you couldn't be any dearer or lovelier or sweeter than you are without turning into that man all men love and even Satan is fond of, Joe Jefferson. I am gratified to see that Mr. Mayo has been able to manage those difficult twins. I tried, but in my hands they failed. Year before last there was an Italian freak on exhibition in Philadelphia who was an exaggeration of the Siamese twins. This freak had one body, one pair of legs, two heads, and four arms. I thought he would be useful in a book, so I put him in, and then the trouble began. I called these consolidated twins Angelo and Luigi, and I tried to make them nice and agreeable, but it was not possible. They would not do anything my way, but only their own. They were wholly unmanageable, and not a day went by that they didn't develop some new kind of devilishness, particularly Luigi. Angelo was of a religious turn of mind, and was monotonously honest and honorable and upright and tediously proper, whereas Luigi had no principles, no morals, no religion, a perfect blatherskite, and an inextricable tangle theologically, infidel, atheist, and agnostic, all mixed together. He was of a malicious disposition, and liked to eat things which disagreed with his brother. They were so strangely organized that what one of them ate or drank had no effect upon himself, but only nourished or damaged the other one. Luigi was hearty and robust, because Angelo ate the best and most wholesome food he could find for him, but Angelo was himself delicate and sickly, because every day Luigi filled him up with mince pies and salt junk, just because he knew he couldn't digest them. Luigi was very dissipated, but it didn't show on him, but only on his brother. His brother was a strict and conscientious teetotaler, but he was drunk most of the time on account of Luigi's habits. Angelo was president of the Prohibition Society, but they had to turn him out, because every time he appeared at the head of the procession on parade, he was a scandalous spectacle to look at. On the other hand, Angelo was a trouble to Luigi, the infidel, because he was always changing his religion, trying to find the best one, and he always preferred sects that believed in baptism by immersion, and this was a constant peril and discomfort to Luigi, who couldn't stand water outside or in. And so, every time Angelo got baptized, Luigi got drowned and had to be pumped out and resuscitated. Luigi was irascible, yet was never willing to stand by the consequences of his acts. He was always kicking somebody and then laying it on Angelo, and when the kicked person kicked back, Luigi would say, "What are you kicking me for? I haven't done anything to you." Then the man would be sorry and say, "Well, I didn't mean any harm, I thought it was you, but you see, you people have only one body between you, and I can't tell which of you I'm kicking. I don't know how to discriminate. I do not wish to be unfair, and so there is no way for me to do but kick one of you and apologize to the other." They were a troublesome pair in every way. If they did any work for you, they charged for two. But at the boarding house they ate and slept for two and only paid for one. In the trains they wouldn't pay for two, because they only occupied one seat. The same at the theater. Luigi bought one ticket and dead-headed Angelo in. They couldn't put Angelo out because they couldn't put the deadhead out without putting out the twin that had paid and scooping in a suit for damages. Luigi grew steadily more and more wicked, and I saw by and by that the way he was going on he was certain to land in the eternal tropics, and at bottom I was glad of it. But I knew he would necessarily take his righteous brother down there with him, and that would not be fair. I did not object to it, but I didn't want to be responsible for it. I was in such a hobble that there was only one way out. To save the righteous brother I had to pull the consolidated twins apart and make two separate and distinct twins of them. Well, as soon as I did that, they lost all their energy and took no further interest in life. They were wholly futile and useless in the book. They became mere shadows, and so they remain. Mr. Mayo manages them, but if he had taken a chance at them before I pulled them apart and tamed them, he would have found out early that if he put them in his play they would take full possession, and there wouldn't be any room in it for Pudd'nhead Wilson or anybody else. I have taken 4 days to prepare these statistics, and as far as they go, you can depend upon their being strictly true. I have not told all the truth about the twins, but just barely enough of it for business purposes, for my motto is, and Pudd'nhead Wilson can adopt it if he wants to, my motto is, "Truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it."
End of curtain speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 71 of Mark Twain speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Morals Lecture, Music Hall, Cleveland, July 15, 1895. Prototype of subsequent tour performances.
I was solicited to go round the world on a lecture tour by a man in Australia. I asked him what they wanted to be lectured on. He wrote back that those people were very coarse and serious, and that they would like something solid, something in the way of education, something gigantic, and he proposed that I prepare about 3 or 4 lectures, at any rate, on just morals, any kind of morals, but just morals. And I like that idea. I liked it very much and was perfectly willing to engage in that kind of work. And I should like to teach morals. I have a great enthusiasm in doing that, and I shall like to teach morals to those people. I do not like to have them taught to me, and I do not know any duller entertainment than that, but I know I can produce a quality of goods that will satisfy those people. If you teach principles, why, you had better let your illustrations come first, illustrations which shall carry home to every person. I planned my first lecture on morals. I must not stand here and talk all night. Get out a watch. I am talking the first time now, and I do not know anything about the length of it. I would start with 2 or 3 rules of moral principles which I want to impress upon those people. I will just make the lecture gradual by and by. The illustrations are the most important, so that when that lecture is by and by written and completed, it will just be a waveless ocean with this archipelago of smiling green islands of illustrations in the midst of it. I thought I would state a principle which I was going to teach. I have this theory for doing a great deal of good out there, everywhere in fact, that you should prize as a priceless thing every transgression, every crime that you commit. The lesson of it, I mean. Make it permanent. Impress it so that you may never commit that same crime again as long as you live. Then you will see yourself what the logical result of that will be, that you get interested in committing crimes. You will lay up, in that way, course by course, the edifice of a personally perfect moral character. You cannot afford to waste any crime. They are not given to you to be thrown away, but for a great purpose. There are 462 crimes possible, and you cannot add anything to this, you cannot originate anything. These have been all thought out, all experimented on, and have been thought out by the most capable men in the penitentiary. Now, when you commit a transgression, lay it up in your memory, and, without stopping, it will all lead toward moral perfection. When you have committed your 462, you are released of every possibility and have ascended the staircase of faultless creation, and you finally stand with your 462 complete, with absolute moral perfection, and I am more than 2/3 up there. It is immense inspiration to find yourself climbing that way, and have not much further to go. I shall have then that moral perfection, and shall then see my edifice of moral character standing far before the world all complete. I know that this should produce it. Why, the first time that I ever stole a watermelon—I think it was the first time, but this is no matter, it was right along there somewhere—I carried that watermelon to a secluded bower. You may call it a bower, and I suppose you may not. I carried that watermelon to a secluded bower in the lumber yard and broke it open, and it was green. Now then, I began to reflect. There is the virtual, that is, the beginning, of reformation when you reflect. When you do not reflect, that transgression is wasted on you. I began to reflect, and I said to myself, I have done wrong. It was wrong in me to steal that watermelon, that kind of a watermelon. And I said to myself, now, what would a right-minded and right-intentioned boy do who found that he had done wrong, stolen a watermelon like this? What would he do? What must he do? Do right. Restitution. Make restitution. He must restore that property to its owner. And I resolved to do that, and the moment I made that good resolution, I felt that electrical moral uplift which becomes a victory over wrong-doing. I was spiritually strengthened and refreshed, and carried that watermelon back to that wagon and gave it to that farmer, restored it to him, and I told him he ought to be ashamed of himself going around working off green watermelons that way on people who had confidence in him, and I told him in my perfectly frank manner it was wrong. I said that if he did not stop he could not have my custom, and he was ashamed. He was ashamed. He said he would never do it again, and I believe that I did that man a good thing, as well as one for myself. He did reform. I was severe with him a little, but that was all. I restored the watermelon and made him give me a ripe one. I morally helped him, and I have no doubt that I helped myself the same time, for that was a lesson which remained with me for my perfection. Ever since that day to this, I never stole another one like that. Then I have another theory, and that is to teach that when you do a thing, do it with all your might, do it with all your heart. I remember a man in California, what is his name, Baker. He was a hearty man of most gentlemanly spirit, and had many fine qualities. He lived a good many years in California among the woods and mountains. He had no companionship but that of the wild creatures of the forest. To me he was an observant man. He watched the ways of the different creatures so that he could understand what the creatures said to each other and translate it accurately. He was the only man I ever knew who could do this. I know he could, because he told me so himself, and he says that some of the animals have very slight education and small vocabulary, and that they are not capable of using figures and allegory. But there are other animals that have a large vocabulary. These creatures are very fond of talking. They like to show off, and he placed the blue jay at the head of that list. He said, "Now, there's more to the blue jay than any other animal. He has got more different kinds of feeling. Whatever a blue jay feels, he can put into language, and not mere commonplace language, but straight out and out book talk, and there is such a command of language. You never saw a blue jay get stuck for a word. He is a vocabularized geyser. Now, you must call a jay a bird, and so he is in a measure, because he wears feathers and don't belong to any church, but otherwise he is just as human nature made him. A blue jay hasn't any more principle than an ex-congressman, and he will steal, deceive, and betray 4 times out of 5. And as for the sacredness of an obligation, you cannot scare him in the detail of principle. He talks the best grammar of all the animals. You may say a cat talks a good grammar. Well, a cat does. But you let a cat get excited, you let a cat get at pulling fur with another cat on a shed nights, and you will hear grammar. A blue jay is human. He has got all a man's faculties and man's weakness. He likes especially scandal. He knows when he is an ass as well as you do."
Baker's blue jay yarn followed, about the jay who tried to fill a cabin with acorns by dropping them through a hole in the roof.
Now, that brings me by a natural and easy transition to Simon Wheeler of California. A pioneer he was, and in a small way a philosopher. Simon Wheeler's creed was that pretty nearly everything that happens to a man can be turned to moral account. Every incident in his life, almost, can be made to assist him, to project him forward morally, if he knows how to make use of the lesson which that episode teaches. And he used, well, he was a good deal of a talker. He was an inordinate talker. In fact, he wore out 3 sets of false teeth, and I told about a friend of his one day, a man that he had known there formerly, and who he had a great admiration for, of one Jim Smiley, and he said it was worth a man's while to know Jim Smiley. Jim Smiley was a man of gift. He was a man of parts. He was a man of learning. He was, well, he was the curious man about always betting on anything that turned up that you ever see, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he would change sides. As soon as he got a bet, he was satisfied. He prepared himself with all sorts of things, tomcats, rat-terriers, and all such things, and one day he catched a frog, said he calculated to educate him, and he took him home and never done nothing but set in his backyard and learn that frog how to jump. Yes, sir, and he did learn him to. He did learn him to. When it came to jumping on a dead level, there wasn't no frog that could touch him at all. Come to jump on the dead level, why, he could lay over any frog in the profession, and Smiley broke all the camps around there betting on that frog. By and by he got a misfortune. He used to keep his frog in a little lattice box. The frog's name was Daniel Webster, and he would bring that box downtown and lay for a bet. And one day a fellow came along, a stranger in the camp he was. He says, "What might it be that you have got in the box?" "Well," Smiley says, "it ain't anything particular, it's only just a frog." "Well," he says, "what is he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, "I don't know, but I think he is good enough for one thing. He can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." The stranger took that box, turned it around this way and that way, and he examined Daniel Webster all over very critically, and handed it back, and he said, "I don't see any points about that frog that is any better than any other frog." "Oh," Smiley said, "it may be that you understand frogs, and may be that you are only an amateur, so to speak. Anyway, I will risk $40 that he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." Well, that stranger looked mighty sad, mighty sorrowful grieved, and he said, "I am only a stranger in camp, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog I would bet you." Smiley says, "That's all right. Just you hold my frog a minute. I will go out and get you a frog." So Smiley lit out to the swamp, and that stranger took that box, and he stood there. Well, he stood and stood, and stood the longest time. At last he got Daniel Webster out of the box, and pried his mouth open like that, took a teaspoonful and filled him full of quail shot, filled him full up to the chin, and set him down on the floor. Daniel set there. Smiley, He flopped around in the swamp about half an hour. Finally he cotched a frog and fetched him to this fellow. They put up the money, and Smiley says, "Now, let the new frog down on the floor with his front paws just even with Daniel's, and I will give the word." He says, "1, 2, 3, Skloot!" And they touched up the frogs from behind to indicate that time was called, and that new frog, he rose like a rocket and came down kerchunk, a yard and a half from where he started. A perfectly elegant jump for a non-professional that way. But Smiley's frog gave a heave or two with his shoulders. His ambition was up, but it was no use. He couldn't budge. He was anchored there as solid as an anvil. The fellow took the money, and finally, as he went away, he looked over his shoulder at Daniel, and he said, "Well, I don't see any points about that frog that is any better than any other frog." And Smiley looked down at Daniel Webster. I never see a man so puzzled, and he says, "I do wonder what that frog throwed off for. There must be something the matter with him. Looks mighty baggy, somehow." He hefted him and says, "Blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds." Turned him upside down and showered out a hatful of shot, and Simon Wheeler said, "That has been a lesson to me." And I say to you, let that be a lesson to you. Don't you put too much faith in the passing stranger. This life is full of uncertainties, and every episode in life, figuratively speaking, is just a frog. You want to watch every exigency as you would a frog, and don't you ever bet a cent on it until you know whether it is loaded or not. He led up to another story by transitional sentences, but this portion of the lecture was not reported. "Now, you think from that man's language, which is not very refined, that he was the bravest man that ever was. That man was not afraid of anything. I never was afraid of anything. I have always had nerve, abundance of nerve. I never lost my nerve but once. Once I lost part of my nerve. I will not say all of it. That time it humiliated me so that I always remember it. When a schoolboy, it often fell to my lot to come across a rainy day, one of those days which schoolboys all the world over regard as too rainy to go to school, and just rainy enough to go fishing. Forbidden fruit had the same attraction for me as it had for Adam. Some unthinking people criticize Adam, find fault with him because he was weak and yielded. Oh, that is not fair, that is not right. He hadn't any experience. We have had ages and ages of experience and tuition, we who criticize him and yet see what we are. Just see what we are when there's any forbidden fruit around. I have been around a good deal, but I have never been in any place where that apple would have been safe, except Allahabad,
or whatever town he was speaking in.
Why, it is the prohibition that makes anything precious. There is a charm about the forbidden that makes it unspeakably desirable. It was not that Adam ate the apple for the apple's sake, but because it was forbidden. It would have been better for us, oh, infinitely better for us, if the serpent had been forbidden. My father was a magistrate, and being a magistrate he was also coroner, sheriff, and Lord Mayor, and he had a little bit of an office in what was the sole room in a small house that stood by itself, and that little office had a sofa in it, and that used to come handy to me now and then, because often I noticed on my way to school that the weather was not suitable for school, and I better go fishing. So I went. But when I came back, when I returned from those excursions, it was not prudent to go home. I always met so many companions and preferences that it was better for me to lodge in that little office. And once, while I was off on one of those excursions, there was a fight late in the afternoon in that little street, and a man was killed, and they carried him to that little office and straightened him out there on the floor, on his back, and got him ready for the inquest in the morning, went away, and left him there. I arrived about midnight, and I did not know about this circumstance, and I slipped in the back way and groped my way through the dark to that sofa and lay there. But just as I was drowsing off to sleep, it seemed to me that I could make out a dim outline of a large black mass of some kind stretched on the floor, and it made me a little uncomfortable. My first thought was to go and feel of it, but I concluded I would not do that. I sat and watched that thing as it lay in parallelograms and squares of moonlight, and I thought I would just wait till that moonlight crept to that thing. It was so slow, that waiting, that finally I got another idea and thought I would turn my face to the wall. And I turned over and counted and counted. I did not get as far as I intended, but at last I forced myself to count the full 100, and then I turned over, and there was a man's hand lying in the square of that moonlight. Why, I never felt so embarrassed in my life. I could not take my eyes away from that object. I watched that moonlight line by line, first revealing an arm, then the white shoulder. By that time it seemed to me that I could stand it no longer. I must pull myself away, and I did. Putting my hand on my heart and holding it there a moment, I took one glimpse, only one glimpse, thank God, and there lay that white, white face, snow-white face, and the glassy eyes. But something made me think, what is the matter with me, as I sat there with my heart beating. I was not scared. I got just that one glimpse, and then I went away from there. I did not go in what you might call a hurry, not a great hurry. I went out the window. I took the sash with me. I did not need the sash, but it was handier to take it than to leave it, so I took it. I shan't have time. The time is too late altogether. I will have to skip that next and come to a matter which illustrates another moral point, which I will tell you about presently, and that is an episode in the lives of 3 persons who lived in Missouri a great many years ago. 2 boys, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and a very particular old friend of theirs, a middle-aged slave named Jim. And these 3 were generally disputing about some subject which was rather too large for them. I, Huck Finn, asked him, Tom Sawyer, what was the trouble, and he said it was heartbreaking to see the days and the years slip away, and him a-getting older and older, and no wars breaking out, no way for him to make a name for himself, and he started in to plan out some way to make him celebrated. Pretty soon he struck it and offered to take me and Jim in. We went up in the woods, and he told me what, and he said it was a crusade. I asked him what a crusade is, and he said, "Is it possible you don't know what a crusade is?" I told him I didn't, and what is more, I didn't care. I have lived through to this time without it, and I had my health, and if you will tell me what it is, all right. I'd as soon I didn't know, for I don't care for stacking my head full of information. What is a crusade? I can tell you. Is it a sort of patent right? No, a crusade is war. It is war to rescue the Holy Land from the heathen cannibals." "Which Holy Land is it?" "Why, there's only one Holy Land. Do you think there is a million?" "Well," I said, "Tom Sawyer, how did we come to let them get in?" "We did not come to let them get hold of it. They always had it. If they always had it, it belongs to them." "Why, certainly," he said. "I understand that now. It seems to me that if I had a farm and it was my farm and it belonged to me and another fellow wanted it, would it be right for him to take it? If they own anything at all there is just the mere land, just the land and nothing else. As for the holiness, they can take that if they want it. You don't understand it at all. You don't get the hang of it at all. It has nothing to do with farming. It is on a higher plane. It is religious." "What? Religious? To go and take the land from the people who own it?" "Why, of course it is. It has always been considered so." I shan't attempt to go on with the rest of that program, but I will just close with that which is at the bottom. I have been in bed, stretched on my back, 45 days, and I am only 5 days out of that bed, and I am, perhaps, not strong enough to stand here and talk. I will just close. It is unbusinesslike to jump at conclusions on too slight evidence, and I will close with the case of christening a baby in a Scotch-Irish family. A little clergyman came, and when he found that there was a great host of people assembled there, he would attempt to exploit his peculiar vanity. He could not resist that temptation. When he took the baby from the father's hands, he hefted it and said, "My friends, he is very little, very little. Well, he is a very little fellow, but what of that? I see in your faces disparagement of him because he is little, disparagement for no cause, but that he is little. You should reflect that it is from the little things that the great things spring. What is smaller than a grain of granite or sand? And yet it is from grains of granite and sand that this earth is formed. Very little is he. Take the little drop of water, and out of little drops of water the great ocean is made. And very little is he, and yet he may become like Napoleon, or like Caesar, or like both of them in one. He may conquer empires. He may turn all the world to looking at him. He may be like Hannibal, or like Alexander, or both in one, and become master of the universe. But what is his name? Mary Ann, is it? I thank you very cordially for the indulgence with which you have listened to my scheme for revolutionizing the morals of the globe as I go around, and I wish to say that I hope to succeed in the work which I have undertaken.
End of Morals Lecture, read by John Greenman. This is section 72 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interview, Vancouver, British Columbia, August 19, 1895. Read by John Greenman. A reporter mentioned the inability of some people to see the point of a joke. Mark Twain took off from there.
When you have a crowded house, some subtle magnetic influence seems to permeate the atmosphere, so that the recognition of the speaker's intention by the audience is unanimous. It often happens that when one is telling a joke to 3 or 4 listeners, only one will perceive its meaning. But with a large auditory, it is invariably the large majority. The depressing influence of a small audience is due to several causes. In the first place, the individual members of that audience feel sorry for the lecturer. Mentally they put themselves in his position and sympathize with him. Such is the charitable disposition of most people. But should the lecturer become scared and rattled, their attitudes change from sympathy to contempt, and contempt is fatal. The sympathetic attitude is hard to fight against, and the ability to do so comes only with experience. Personally, some of my most enthusiastic audiences have been small ones. Many years ago I delivered a lecture in St. Louis. The hall was a very large one, with a seating capacity of about 1,000 persons, I believe, no galleries, but every seat occupying the same level. The night was terribly stormy, and there were perhaps 80 people in the hall, and with that exception a vast acreage of chairbacks confronted me. The feeling of a lecturer at such junctures should not be despondent. Every man's presence should be regarded as an individual compliment. If there are only 15 people present, there are 15 compliments, and it surely is not necessary to multiply a compliment by 15 in order to appreciate it. I requested everybody to come forward and sit in a solid phalanx. It was like lecturing to the disciples on the edge of the Sahara, but I started off, and instead of lecturing for an hour and a half only, I kept it up for more than 2 hours. Among my auditory, as I afterwards learned, was H. M. Stanley, who took down the lecture in shorthand. The subject of hotels came up, particularly changes in lighting systems. Formerly, when staying at some hotel, I would enter my bedroom and find the gas jet turned down, as I thought, and, feeling inclined for a read and a smoke, I would attempt to turn it up, only to find that the flame was at its maximum. Sometimes I would complain and solicit an amelioration of affairs. Then the hotel people had recourse to a trick, which I soon became aware of, and which has never deceived me since. A waiter would put on a pair of overalls and pretend to be an engineer, or a plumber, or some such thing. He would tinker with the gas as long as I remained at the hotel, but never improved it as far as I could see. Consequently, I found it useful to travel with a wax candle, and when the electric light was introduced into hotels, I was among the first to rejoice. But commencing at some point, the exact position of which is ambiguous, and proceeding westward, the hotels seem to be concerned with the spirit of economy. The electric light is only turned on at a certain hour in the evening, and no matter how dark or foggy the day may be, so dark that even those who dwelt in Egyptian darkness would find it impossible to see, unless otherwise provided, you cannot obtain artificial light. So even now my wax candle has been of use to me.
End of interview, read by John Greenman. This is section 73 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. His grandfather's old ram, told on the World Tour 1895 to 1896, and on other occasions. Read by John Greenman.
Well, as I was a-sayin', he bought that old ram from a feller up in Siskiyou County, and fetched him home and turned him loose in the medder, and next morning he went down to have a look at him, and accidentally dropped a 10-cent piece in the grass, and stooped down, so, and was a-fumblin' around in the grass to git it, and the ram he was a-standin' up the slope takin' notice, but my grandfather wasn't taking notice, because he had his back to the ram and was interested about the dime. Well, there he was, as I was a-sayin', down at the foot of the slope a-bending over, so, fumbling in the grass, and the ram he was up there at the top of the slope, and Smith was a-standing there, no, not just there, a little further away, 15 foot perhaps. Well, my grandfather was a-stooping way down, so, and the ram was up there observing, and Smith musing, the ram he bent his head down, so. Smith of Calaveras, no, it couldn't have been Smith of Calaveras. I remember now that but George, it was Smith of Tulare County. Course it was. I remember it now perfectly plain. Well, Smith, he just stood there, and my grandfather, he stood just here, and he was a-bending down, just so, fumbling in the grass. And when the old ram see him in that attitude, he took it for an invitation. And here he come, down the slope 30 mile an hour, and his eye full of business. You see, my grandfather's back being to him, and him stooping down like that, of course why, sure, it weren't Smith of Tulare at all, it was Smith of Sacramento. My goodness, how did I ever come to get them Smiths mixed like that? Why, Smith of Tulare was just a nobody, but Smith of Sacramento, why, the Smiths of Sacramento come of the best Southern blood in the United States. There weren't ever any better blood south of the line than the Sacramento Smiths. Why, look here, one of them married a Whitaker. I reckon that gives you an idea of the kind of society the Sacramento Smiths could associate round in. There ain't no better blood than the Whitaker blood. I reckon anybody'd tell you that. Well, look at Maria Whitaker. There was a girl for you. Little? Why, yes, she was little, but what of that? Look at the heart of her. Had a heart like a bullock, just as good and sweet and lovely and generous as the day is long. If she had a thing and you wanted it, you could have it. Have it and welcome. Why, Maria Whitaker couldn't have a thing and another person need it and not get it. Get it and welcome. She had a glass eye, and she used to lend it to Flora Ann Baxter that hadn't any, to receive company with. Well, she was pretty large, and it didn't fit. It was a number 7, and she was excavated for a 14, and so that eye wouldn't lay still. Every time she winked it would turn over. It was a beautiful eye, and set her off admirable, because it was a lovely pale blue on the front side, the side you look out of, and it was gilded on the back side. Didn't match the other eye, which was one of them browny, yellery eyes, and tranquil and quiet, the way that kind of eyes are. But that warn't any matter. They worked together all right and plenty picturesque. When Flora Ann winked, that blue and gilt eye would whirl over, and the other one stand still. And as soon as she begun to get excited, that handmade eye would give a whirl, and then go on a-whirlin' faster and faster, and a-flashing, first blue and then yaller, and then blue and then yaller. And when it got to whizzing and flashing like that, the oldest man in the world couldn't keep up with the expression on that side of her face. Flora Ann Baxter married a Hagedorn. I reckon that lets you understand what kind of blood she was. Old Maryland Eastern Shore blood. Not a better family in the United States than the Hagedorns. Sally, that's Sally Hagedorn, Sally married a missionary, and they went off carrying the good news to the cannibals out in one of them way-off islands around the world in the middle of the ocean summers. And they ate her, ate him too, which was irregular. It weren't the custom to eat the missionary, but only the family. And when they see what they had done, they was dreadful sorry about it. And when the relations sent down there to fetch away the things, they said so right out. Said they was sorry, and apologized. and said it shouldn't happen again, said 'twas an accident. Accident. Now, that's foolishness. There ain't no such thing as an accident. There ain't nothing happens in the world but what's ordered just so by a wiser power than us, and it's always for a good purpose. We don't know what the good purpose was sometimes, and it was the same with the families that was short a missionary and his wife. But that ain't no matter, and it ain't any of our business. All that concerns us is that it was a special providence, and it had a good intention. No, sir, there ain't no such thing as an accident. Whenever a thing happens that you think is an accident, you make up your mind it ain't no accident at all. It's a special providence. Well, you look at my Uncle Lem. What do you say to that? That's all I ask you. You just look at my Uncle Lem and talk to me about accidents. It was like this. One day, my Uncle Lem and his dog was downtown, and he was a-leaning up against a scaffolding, sick or drunk or something. There was an Irishman with a hod of bricks up the ladder along about the third story, and his foot slipped, and down he come, bricks and all, and hit a stranger fair and square, and knocked the everlasting aspirations out of him. He was ready for the coroner in 2 minutes. Now then, people said it was an accident. Accident? There weren't no accident about it. 'Twas a special providence, and had a mysterious, noble intention back of it. The idea was to save that Irishman. If the stranger hadn't been there, that Irishman would have been killed. The people said, "Special providence, sho the dog was there. Why didn't the Irishman fall on the dog? Why weren't the dog app'inted?" For a mighty good reason the dog would have seen him a-comin'. You can't depend on no dog to carry out a special providence. You couldn't hit a dog with an Irishman because, let me see, what was that dog's name? Musing. Oh, yes, Jasper. And a mighty good dog, too. He wasn't no common dog. He wasn't no mongrel. He was a composite. A composite dog is a dog that's made up of all the valuable qualities that's in the dog breed, kind of a syndicate, and a mongrel is made up of the riff-raff that's left over. That Jasper was one of the most wonderful dogs you ever see. Uncle Lem got him of the Wheelers. I reckon you've heard of the Wheelers. Ain't no better blood south of the line than the Wheelers. Well, one day Wheeler was a-meditating and dreaming around in the carpet factory, and the machinery made a snatch at him, and first you know, he was a-meandering all over the factory from the garret to the cellar, and everywhere at such another gait as—why, you couldn't even see him. You could only hear him whiz when he went by. Well, you know a person can't go through an experience like that and arrive back home the way he was when he went. No, Wheeler got wove up into 39 yards of best three-ply carpeting. The widder was sorry. She was uncommon sorry, and loved him and done the best she could for him in the circumstance, which was unusual. She took the whole piece, 39 yards, and she wanted to give him proper and honorable burial. But she couldn't bear to roll him up. She took and spread him out full length, and said she wouldn't have it any other way. She wanted to buy a tunnel for him, but there wasn't any tunnel for sale. So she boxed him in a beautiful box and stood it on the hill on a pedestal 21 foot high, and so it was monument and grave together, and economical, 60 foot high. You could see it from everywhere, and she painted on it, "To the loving memory of 39 yards best three-ply carpeting containing the mortal remainders of Millington G. Wheeler, go thou and do likewise." End of His Grandfather's Old Ram, read by John Greenman. This is section 74 of Mark Twain Speaking.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dinner Speech. Dinner for Mark Twain, Yorick Club, Melbourne, Australia, October 3, 1895. Read by John Greenman.
It is not worth while to try to put into language the delight that you give me when you receive me in this hearty way. Language is for another office. Language is simply to portray the milder emotions of the human heart. But a welcome like this, a welcome that comes out of the heart deep down, and expressed in a way that one cannot mistake, that is a thing which moves a man all the way through and through. It does seem to me that in order to get such a welcome you've got to come all the way from America to Australia. You Australians seem to deserve the title of the cordial nation. I have seen so much of your kindness, and have been so moved by it, and so charmed with it, that in thinking things over, I sit and think sometimes, and try to make out the characteristics of this nation and the characteristics of that nation, try to fasten a trademark on them, putting down one as frivolous, another as ox-like and stupid, a third as vivacious, and so on. It seems to me that you should be branded and trademarked as the cordial nation, certainly when you meet me, and that is most pleasant, that is most delightful. Now, I have been to a great many places where there were things to eat, where there was a supper, and where there was a chairman, and the distinctive quality of that chairman was always to make a speech that had nothing in it which you could use as a text afterwards. That was the way with all the chairmen I ever saw, except this one. But he has really so loaded me up with texts that it is an embarrassment of riches. I don't know where to begin. If I used all the texts he has furnished me with, there would be nothing left of us when I got through. There is one fact he brought out happily which stupid people who speak the English language all over this world are prone to overlook or to ignore, and that is, let us chafe and jaw and criticize one another as we please. When all is said and done, the Americans and the English and their great outflow in Canada and Australia are all one. You have not stayed at home all your lives, and you know that sentiment which I have felt so many times. I have been around a good deal here and there in the world, and there is one thing that I have always noticed, and which you must have noticed under similar circumstances. Let one of us be far away from his own country, be it Australia or England or America or Canada, and let him see either the English flag or the American flag, and I defy him not to be stirred by it. Oh, yes, blood is thicker than water, and we are all related. If we do jaw and bawl at each other now and again, that is no matter at all. We do belong together, and we are parts of a great whole, the greatest whole this world has ever seen, a whole that some day will spread over this world, and, I hope, annihilate and abolish all other communities. It will be the survival of the fittest. The English is the greatest race that ever was, and will prove itself so before it gets done, and I would like to be there to see it. I am getting old. I am getting pretty old, but I don't find it out when I am around this way. It is when one sits at home, melancholy perhaps, when nothing is going on. But when I'm around this way with my own kind, I don't know that I'm not quite young again, say 15 or 16, and I feel perfectly comfortable. My friend on the right and I were talking just now about that very thing. I said I thought that if I had created the human race, I could have done it. I was asked nothing about it, and I didn't suggest anything. But I thought that if I had created the human race, and had discovered that they were a kind of failure, and had drowned them out, well, I would recognize that that was a good thing, and then, fortified by experience, I would start the thing on a different plan. I would have no more of that 969 years business. I wouldn't let people grow that old. I would cut them off at 30, because a man's youth is the thing he loves to think about, and it is the thing that he regrets. It is the one part of his life that he most thoroughly enjoys. My friend on the right suggests that we should go as far as 40 years, as he doesn't want any of his 40 years rubbed out. Well, perhaps you really might go up to 40, because then you get a perspective upon youth, and that has its value. That has its charm. But oh, dear me, I never would have created age. Age has its own value, but that is to other people, not to those who have it. The chairman, among other things, touched upon my experience as a Mississippi pilot. That is connected with what I am now talking about. That is one of those things that you engage in when you are young and careless, and a man ought always to be young and careless. Then everything that comes is satisfactory. You don't suppose that I should enjoy being a pilot on a Mississippi steamboat now, and be scared to death every time it came a fog? But at that time fogs and dark nights had a charm for me. I didn't own any stock in that steamboat, and that is one of the very advantages of youth. You don't own any stock in anything. You have a good time, and all the grief and trouble is with the other fellows. Youth is a lovely thing, and certainly never was there a diviner time to me in this world. All the rest of my life is one thing, but my life as a pilot on the Mississippi River, when I was young, oh, that was the darling existence. There has been nothing comparable to it in my life since. And speaking of that, I may tell you a little story. I had that sort of instinct which anybody would have who had been separated by long years from a life of that kind. He would look back and remember this thing and that thing and everything that happened to him when he was young. It was all so dear, and so beautiful, and so fine, so much finer than anything he had experienced since. Well, I carried out that instinct, and I went out to the Mississippi River about 1880. I had not seen that river for I don't know how long, perhaps for a quarter of a century, and I went there with a sort of longing. One sometimes has a yearning to see again the scenes that were dear to him in his youth, in his prime, in the time when he had the heart to feel, and I thought I would like to see that river and what was left of that steamboat life exactly as I saw it long, long, long ago. And so I went under a fictitious name. I didn't want to be found out. I wanted to be able to go up into the pilot house and talk to that pilot just as I used to see passengers talk to him, and I wanted to ask him the same idiotic questions, and I wanted to get myself loaded up with the same misinformation just as they used to do. So I went under a fictitious name, and the thing went along very well until, after I had signed my name John W. Fletcher on the register of the Southern Hotel in St. Louis, the man behind the counter bowed and said pleasantly, "Show Mr. Clemens to number 165." Now you can imagine the interest I felt when I really was launched on the steamboat. She was a vile, rusty old steamboat, but she was the only one that was going down the river that day, and I wanted to go. I got on board that boat 2 hours before she was advertised to sail, and I was so anxious to see again that old steamboat life I had been so familiar with. I knew she wouldn't sail at the time she was advertised, but I knew she would go some time that week. I was loafing about the decks, just as happy as a man could be, noticing details in the construction of that boat which I hadn't seen in any other boat or ship for ever so long. After a while there came a curious-looking sort of creature slouching up on the hurricane deck. He accosted me and asked where I was from. I said from the state of Connecticut, from the city of Hartford in Connecticut. He said, "You're a good long way from home." I said I recognized that. I felt it. Then he said, "Now I reckon you've no such boat as this there. You never seen a boat like this before?" Well, I intimated that I never had. I wouldn't lie to a man like that. He said, "I was born and raised away in the interior of Wisconsin. I never saw a river or a steamboat till a week ago. Then I came all the way down in a boat like this. If you like, I'll show you around and tell you the names of the different things and what they're for." Well, he seemed kindly disposed, and I went round with him. He showed me this and that, and I soon saw that lots of information had been furnished to him by an expert. He hadn't got a thing right. Some of those people on steamboats can't be depended upon. And they had just loaded him up, giving him false names for things, or, when they gave him the right names, telling him extraordinary uses to which the things were said to be put. So the poor devil didn't know anything about a steamboat at all. Well, he left me, and I didn't see any more of him for some time. When the boat had sailed, I was so impatient that I got up in the morning with the first dawn to see what I could of that majestic river, which used to be as familiar to me as the joints of my own fingers, a river that I knew foot by foot, detail by detail, night or day, for 1,300 miles. I was impatient to find if that old river was still familiar to me. I did hope that I would recognize some parts of it, but when I came up on that hurricane deck and looked around, I saw that that hope was blighted. I didn't seem to recognize any part of it at all. At length I saw a place on the right-hand side where there were some willows growing that I thought I did recognize, but no, I knew those willows were, so to speak, creatures of a day, and that there must have been hundreds of them since I was there 20 years before. It was a deep disappointment to me, but then I thought, never mind, I can cheer up the occasion by getting up into that pilot-house and letting that man load me up with a lot of lies, as they did the historical passenger. I glanced up 3 or 4 times to make sure I had never seen that pilot before. No, he was too young for me to know at all. He must have come into the pilot-house after I left the river 20 years before. I crept up in there, and to my joy I was received exactly like the passenger of the old times. The pilot, when he heard the latch of the door, turned round and gave me that sort of indifferent look, a look that was, oh, so indifferent that if you could just get capital enough and collect enough of it, you wouldn't need any of those refrigerating processes. It would freeze all the sheep in Australia. The old thing exactly. I didn't expect any more notice, and I didn't want any. I sunk down on the bench in the pilot-house. There was a little boy about 7 years old playing round. I got into conversation with him for a few minutes, and then he went away, and we were left alone, I and that pilot who had no hospitality, no welcome for me. And then I began to ask my questions, just as the old-time passenger did. I said, just in the same timid way, "Would you be kind enough to tell me what that thing there is for, that speaking tube?" "Oh," he said, "that speaking tube. That's to call the chambermaid." Well, I felt so happy. The thing was going beautifully. I asked him another question about another speaking tube. He said that was to call the boy that scrubbed the deck. What was that bell for? You know, the bell that signals go ahead and so on. That was to call somebody else. Everything was to call somebody. That man could not apparently tell the truth, even by accident, and so I felt perfectly happy. I was getting loaded up just as I wanted, and I would put it in a book. It was jolly good stuff, and I was feeling very comfortable. All of a sudden he says, "Look here, just hold her a minute. I have to go downstairs and get some coffee." And away he went. Well, instinct made me take the wheel. You mustn't leave a steamer to pilot herself. Then I looked round to see if I could make out where we were, and now I recognized the place at once. I knew it perfectly. It was the only place between St. Louis and a point 200 miles below where there were any dangerous rocks. I recognized it as the very worst place in the whole Mississippi River from Lake Itasca to the ocean, a place called the Grand Chain. Even an apprentice pilot who had been through it a few times would never forget it in all his life, because the marks have to be so exactly followed. There is one place where there is a crossing 2 miles long, and in the very midst of it there are 2 rocks. Neither of them shows above the water, but they make a little break which you can hardly notice. These deadly rocks are only 70 feet apart, and a Mississippi steamboat is 25 feet wide, so you must not diverge at all. If you hit one of those rocks you would be in heaven in 2 minutes. I recognized that I was in the Grand Chain, but didn't know exactly what part of it. I suspected, though, that I was in the part that passes between those 2 rocks. However, I knew one thing, that that pilot would never have put that wheel into my hands until he had satisfied himself that the boat lay exactly in the right course. He knew that if I had any sense at all, I had sense enough to keep between the marks, which I did most diligently. We passed between the rocks, and I saw those breaks, and I didn't do any harm. But I was very glad when he came back. Then he said, "You go and play fictitious names on people and try to get your fun out of them, but I knew your damned drawl the minute you spoke to that boy." Well, of course we got to be friendly then. Turned out that just as I was leaving the river he had finished his apprenticeship, but he had struck a pretty bad snag, and he could only get one pilot to sign his application. He was required to have 2. He was looking round, and he found me, and I signed his papers and saved him, made a pilot of him. So we had a jolly good time. I was always on his watch, and the other fellow's watch, too. I stood all the watches there were. All the day long, no matter which pilot's turn it was, I took the wheel. I couldn't get enough of it. The river was bank full, and from where the Ohio comes in all the way down to New Orleans there was nothing to do but to keep round in this bend and cross into that bend. You could never make any mistake. A jackass could pilot a steamboat in that part of the river if he had just wit enough to follow the shape of the river. So the pilots would leave me there the whole watch, and there in that sunny country I would stand at the wheel and pilot along down and ponder and think and dream over all that old vanished time on the river. It was delightful, full of pathos, full of poetry, full of the charm of unconsciousness of anything else in the world but that old past. I heard the latch of the pilot-house door raised, but I didn't hear anybody come in. I turned around, and who should be standing there but that Wisconsin hayseed fellow I hadn't seen since he showed me the things on the steamboat at St. Louis. He stood there sort of petrified, gazing at me, and he said, well, I won't repeat what he said, it was profane, but it was eloquent. But I mustn't stand here and talk all night of old reminiscences. I was going through all the texts of the chairman, but now I come to think of it, I had forgotten it for the minute. I am entertaining a carbuncle unawares. I have got it on my port hind leg, and it reminds me of its company occasionally. I have greater respect for it than for any other possession I have in the world. I take more care of it than I do of the family. But before I sit down, I just want to thank you once again for your kind and cordial reception of me tonight, and to assure you that I do most sincerely appreciate it and value it.
End of dinner speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 75 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 4 speeches. Smoke Night, Australian Institute of Journalists, Cathedral Hotel, Melbourne, Australia, October 27, 1895.
Mr. Chairman and gentlemen, I thank you very heartily and very sincerely for this testimony of good feeling and comradeship toward me, and also for the additional compliment you have paid me in coupling my wife's name to all you have said. I am glad to perceive at last, after waiting all these many, many weary years, which I supposed had been wasted, that in one instance at least my labor has not been in vain. I recognize that in lifting Mr. Dow out of the sheep run I have conferred a benefit upon the human race, and also upon the sheep. It is one more testimony to me that when we sow the seed of our works round the world, we never know whether we are sowing upon fruitful ground or scattering the seed upon the rocky land where it will not spring up and bear fruit. Now, it was the last thing that I ever thought of that my experiences as an agricultural newspaper editor were conferring a benefit upon anyone. Why, you see for yourselves the hopelessness of the case. It was the one case, perhaps, in which I never had hope of any kind, but it is out of my defeat that springs Mr. Dow's success. I performed the functions of that office well and picturesquely, but they were not appreciated, no more than his are by the farmer of today. I was discharged, and all because of my writing about ornamental oyster beds. Just a little thing like that, ornamental oyster beds, under the heading of landscape gardening. I have no doubt that is a lesser crime than 1,000,000 he has committed, but it cost me my position. Now I am very, very glad to be here tonight. This is a world of surprises, it is indeed. The longer one lives, the more he finds it so. Now I have always contended that shams ought to be banished out of this world. In my small way I have made war upon shams, and yet here I am confronted, pointing to Mr. Dow, with one. I doubt not but that he is 100 times more valuable than he would be if he were the real article. Now, if there is one thing in this world that I detest more than another, it is the peal of a public bell, a bell that rings and chimes and counts the hours for you at night when you want to sleep and when you don't care and don't want to know anything about the hours. But that isn't sufficient. There is a jangle, jangle, jangle that they call chimes. Now, here I come, and there, at the end of the room, is a sham chime. I could sit and listen to that for a week. Now that is a sham, but it is infinitely superior to my ears to the original. And why is that so? I recognize why it is. It is because it is such an absolutely exact imitation of the real thing. When you see a magnificent sunset or a superb landscape, or the sea in the highest poetry of its motion, you feel in your soul that the very highest compliment you can pay it is to say that it so exactly resembles a scene in a theater. There it is. The scene portrayed in the theater is a sham, not the reality. But you compliment the reality by saying that it is a good imitation of the imitation. And so I shall always remember those chimes, and shall bless them so long as I shall curse the original. Then there is that music played on the lead pencil. I have been present many a time when an interviewer has played upon a lead pencil. But when I listened to that music from a lead pencil just now, I recognized there a superiority of sweetness that I never detected before in a lead pencil at all. I am glad I came here tonight. I would not have missed it for anything. You play a kind of music I understand and like. It is home-like. It suits this uneducated ear of mine. I think that when you delight in the common tunes of a country, that is the highest form of musical education. Possibly it is so. Let it be so in my case. The music that we have had here tonight suits me exactly, and I thank the performers as I thank you, gentlemen, for this very hospitable reception you have given me. Alfred I. Deacon, M.L.A., presented a basket of flowers from his own garden as a gift to Mrs. Clemens and Clara. I think this is a peculiarly gratifying occurrence, to join my family with me in the hospitalities which you extend to us. We have come a long distance, which at first it was my purpose to traverse alone. But I always have many purposes which fail, for reasons which those who are married among you will understand. I am technically boss of the family which I am carrying along, but I am grateful to know that it is only technically, that the real authority rests on the other side of the house. It is placed there by a beneficent Providence, who foresaw before I was born, or if he did not, he has found it out since, that I am not in any way qualified to travel alone. And so it has been my good fortune to be furnished with a wife who is always capable, both by brain and by heart, to make up all the shortcomings which exist in me. She has brought me through for 25 years successfully, and while I do attribute that to an overruling Providence, my experience with Providence has not been of a nature to give me great confidence in his judgment, and I consider that my wife crept in while his attention was occupied elsewhere. I have a wife and daughter thoroughly well equipped to appreciate these beautiful flowers, and I accept them in their name with very, very sincere thanks. By acclamation, the Assembly elected Mark Twain an honorary member of the Australian Institute of Journalists. I thank you cordially, gentlemen, for the honor you have just done me. I have been a journalist a great many years, and still consider myself a journalist, since I contribute to journalism in America at least, and it is particularly gratifying to me to be received in this way, and to have this honor conferred upon me. It is not a matter of whether I deserve it or not, and I know that perfectly well. The honor as conferred is out of the heart, and from the heart one receives it. I am very, very glad to receive it indeed. I had already considered before this that this was a peculiarly pleasant evening, a darling evening of my life. I am now on the verge of 60 years. In the month of November, so close at hand, I shall be 60 years of age. I have detested old age from my infancy, and anything that removes from me even for a few moments the consciousness that I am old is gratifying to me. For the 2 or 3 hours that I have been here tonight, since 9 o'clock struck and I entered this room, I have gone back 30 years and have rejuvenated. I have been young again. I have renewed my youth, and have felt exactly as I felt 30 years ago, when the boys were having a good time. I have forgotten my gray hairs, and since 9 o'clock they have been a sham. I have been utterly happy tonight, and why should I not have been happy? I have eternal winter (pointing to the chairman) on my right hand, and I have youth and everlasting summer distributed about me. I have been happy before this, but now you have made my happiness perfect. After several musical numbers, Mark Twain spoke again. May I have the privilege of proposing a toast? I desire to propose the health of the chairman. I do not know the particulars of the chairman's history at all, but on an occasion of this kind it would not be gracious, it would not be pleasant, it would not be in good taste to expose that. Let us overlook his past. Let us consider that whatever he has been before this evening, that has all gone by, and from this time out he is a reformed man. So now let us drink his health, not as the health of the man we had known heretofore, but as the man who is going to rise infinitely superior to anything he has been before, and whose character will now shine from this time out with a refulgent light. I don't know what refulgent light is, but it is a good expression, and good words make eloquence, whether they mean anything or not. Let us drink with enthusiasm to this reformed case. Mr. Zox, M.L.A., proposed the health of Miss Clara Clemens, whereupon Mark Twain made his 5th speech of the evening, but it was not reported. End of 4 speeches read by John Greenman. This is section 76 of Mark Twain speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Supper Speech. Savage Club Supper for Mark Twain, Provincial Council Chamber, Christchurch, New Zealand, November 15, 1895. Read by John Greenman. Mr. Chairman and savages, as you call yourselves, for some reason best known to yourselves, for certainly I should not have taken you for such. I have mixed a good deal with the lower order of savages, and I have seen them in all costumes and in no costumes at all, in all costumes except this one that you wear this evening. With my experience of savages, I know that however picturesque they may be in their dress, and sometimes they are very picturesque, the costume which I see before me is the best one suited to educated and cultured savages. I am glad to meet this kind of savages. I have been received in such a pleasant way ever since I have been in New Zealand and Australia, and this is another case of the kind, that I should like to return general thanks to all the friends who have given me these pleasant receptions. And I must return special thanks to you, gentlemen, for this great honor in making me an honorary member, and, as you say, the first honorary member of your club. It makes me feel as large as your great moa, and if I go on dissipating like this, I shall be as extinct as your great moa. Have you ever considered how difficult the position of the guest of the evening on an occasion such as this is? For there is only one speech made before he must get on his feet, and that does not generally afford him a very fruitful text to talk upon, for it consists of compliments to him, and if you listened point blank to compliments fired at you at short range, and have had to talk on a text like that, you must know how weak your position is. You must have recognized that however great and fine those compliments are, you do deserve them. If there is a lack anywhere, it is that they fall a little short of your deserts. But even if, for that reason, the text they afford you is not a good one, you perceive that it would not be in good taste for you to get up and correct the gentleman who is speaking. There is that spirit of inborn modesty in an American which forbids him to do a thing of that kind. I think that the prodigal son, when he returned, was received just like this, and all that was said then must have been compliments, and he could not properly respond to them because he knew they were only compliments. However, I have not been like him. I have been setting an example to all peoples as I have been going along. I have been doing good. You haven't mentioned any of these things, so I am without a text. The guest of the evening ought always to sit still until all the other people had had their say, and from listening to them he could get a text, and find out how things stand, and be able to talk back. It is much easier to talk back to abuse than to compliments. We have had a good time these last few days, and I have felt what a good time Christ Church must have been having too. You have never had such opportunities for enlightenment before. You have had the circus. That was spectacular. You have had Mr. Haskett Smith, imagination, and you have had my well-beloved friend and shipmate, Michael Davitt, philosophy, and you have had me, cold fact. We are all fading away, one by one. Haskett Smith has gone. Michael Davitt has gone. I leave tomorrow, and you have nothing left but the circus. Be grateful for the opportunities you have. Hang on to that circus. I observe in this region a spirit which I do greatly approve. That is the spirit which is leading us gradually and surely along to prohibition. I do not see any signs of it here. It is coming, and let us welcome it. I can tell you one thing, that is, if you get it, you will find it will put you into most difficult straits. In our country, several years ago, there was a man came into a prohibition town, a man like you savages here, and they said to him, "You can't get a drink anywhere except at the apothecary's." So he went to the apothecary, who said, "You can't get a drink here without a prescription from a physician." But the man said, "I'm perishing. I haven't had time to get a prescription." The apothecary replied, "Well, I haven't the power to give you a drink except for snake bite." The man said, "Where's the snake?" So the apothecary gave him the snake's address, and he went off. Soon after, however, he came back and said, "For goodness sake, give me a drink. That snake is engaged for months ahead." Now, I thank you again, particularly for the honorable distinction of membership. I thought it might be that I was a member before, by having membership in the Lotus Club of New York, which is affiliated to the Savage Club of London, but I find that it is not so. However, I am proud to belong to this gang of savages. I hope to learn that war whoop of yours, and as I am one of those early birds, and not given to talking except when I do all the talking myself, I will thank you all again and resume my seat.
End of Supper Speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 77 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Speech, Commemoration Luncheon, Glenelg, Australia, December 30th, 1895. Read by John Greenman.
Necessarily I deplore with Sir Richard Baker any thought or suggestion of war between America and England, for certainly never in the history of mankind would any war, or was any war, so disastrous as this suggested war would be. We know Lord Macaulay said the effects of the 30 Years' War were felt in the valley of the Mississippi 200 years after the event, but the effects of this war may extend over 5 centuries. It would certainly stand in the way of the progress and intelligence of the whole world for generations. Therefore, you will listen to no talk of war between these countries. Blood is thicker than water, and there must be no blood shed between England and America. I recognize in the remarks made by the Commissioner of Public Works that feeling, which was also suggested in the speech of his worship, that feeling of sentiment which exists between England and America, and which is not called into force except under stress like this talk of war. I remember reading of some distinguished American traveling through France being suddenly awakened up by a name, the name of that great battle fought by Henry V upon the soil of France, and this American said he felt exalted. He thought, why should that be? Why should it make my heart bound to think that 8,000 Englishmen under Henry V had slaughtered 60,000 Frenchmen under the French king and the chivalry of France? So he had to stop and reflect of what source the feeling was, and he recognized that it was the English blood flowing in his veins which was answering after 500 years to his English ancestors. So blood is thicker than water. I am glad to say I know there is another American present. I did not suspect it until I heard him lift up his voice, and when he lifted it up I knew by certain signs that there was another American here. Those signs are patented. Those signs are these: that his voice was for peace between England and America. Another sign was that in all he said there was no suggestion of anything but cast-iron veracity. In all he said there was truth, and by that truth I knew he was an American. There was another sign that there was another American present. I noticed he made more noise than the other 7 speakers. Now, by the voice of the visitors whom I represent, I thank your worship for the hospitality which you have extended to us. I have the privilege to congratulate you upon certain things: your supreme climate. When it was mentioned by these gentlemen here you did not respond with enthusiasm, but perhaps to you your climate is commonplace, but it is not commonplace to other people at all. I am not used to a climate like this. In these specimens it is altogether perfect. When in midwinter you have summer, and where you have neither mosquitoes nor snow. It is real pleasant to those travelers who are come from the overworked regions of the earth. What satisfaction it is to find ourselves in this restful South Australia, and where, apparently, it is always a holiday, and where, when you have no holiday and nothing else to do, it is always a horse race. It has become a blessed land, it seems to me. And then you have a spirit of independence here which cannot be overpraised. You place your holidays not in accordance with the day, but to suit your own comfort and convenience. I passed through Australia when you were celebrating the Prince of Wales' birthday upon the 8th, upon the 10th, or upon the 11th, skipped the 9th altogether. I suppose there was a horse race. I consider it a privilege to be present upon this day. No doubt it is your greatest day. There can be no worthier day to celebrate than the day that saw the foundation of this community to join the march of civilization, learning, and liberty. I saw the old gum tree as I came along, and as I approached it, it seemed bent down with age, discouragement, and despair. But later I saw it formed a perfect arch, the symbol of strength and perpetuity. May this colony last forever, and be always prosperous. It seemed to me that in my responding for the visitors there is a sort of incongruity about it, an infelicity. It seemed impossible for me to stand here in this formal attitude as if a visitor, when I have been in these colonies 3½ months, and when from the beginning half of the people seemed to recognize me as a member of their family. After the luncheon a select group repaired to a reception in the mayor's parlor, where the premier of the province proposed the health of Mark Twain. He responded with a humorous speech, which was not reported. End of speech, read by John Greenman.